Pastor Broughton and President Harrison have really done a lot of the work for me, so let me also lay out kind of the outline of what I'm going to talk about. They've both shown you the theology that lines up with, comports with the Augsburg Confession. And by the way, we should take a step back and just say that the Augsburg Confession is the defining characteristic of Lutherans. Just historically, this is a big deal. 1530. This is the turning point. And so there are two official versions of that. One's in German, one's in Latin. So rightly called or a regular public call. Those are the two ways it's mentioned. And as you just heard from President Harrison, what the task force, my job is to, now that we've kind of had this historical outline now, tell you why the task force's recommendations are a good idea, why, especially if you're a delegate, you should support them actively, and that even if you're not a delegate, why you should support them actively. We'll talk about what that means in a bit. The task force, as you just heard from President Harrison, can be very easily summed up. Everybody who's pastoring is going to be a pastor. The rest of the task force is just different ways we're going to get there for different groups of people based on specific circumstances. Okay? So you've heard all the reasons why that's true, why that's good theology, and so you may be sitting here at this point thinking, well, what's the problem? Why do we do this in 1989? Why didn't we get it fixed in 92, 95, 98, 2001, 2004, 2007, 2010, 2013? Well, I'm going to tell you. And so what I've set myself the task for to put this in a greater context, because especially you delegates, you're going to go out to the convention, and there's going to be people lined up with a microphone, and they're going to be saying all kinds of things. They're going to disagree with everything you've heard about so far today, and you're going to be, well, what's going on? So now, as another one of your prophets used to say, but he's dead, the rest of the story. Okay, I'm going to start off by adding one thing to Broughton's essay, and then highlighting a very important aspect of it that he mentioned that I want to highlight. We don't, as President Harrison just mentioned, we don't exist in a vacuum. We're in fellowship with, I lose track of it. How many is it? 19, 23, 29?
Well, 36 now.
Yeah, up to 36 different church bodies around the world we're all-term pulpit fellowship with. So, I mean, hey, you can get a foreigner, you can get rid of your pastor and get somebody exciting in there. From all over the world, right? We're in fellowship with them. Well, in 1991, our sister church in Germany, fired a shot across the bow. And how's this for a German title? Only Germans title things like this. Information and position statement on the question of lay ministry in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, Theological Commission of the Independent Evangelical Lutheran Church of Germany, Selk, September 4, 1991, by the Reverend Dr. Job Schena, Bischof. Okay? You should read that. They said, hey guys, this isn't cool. That this is damaging our fellowship. So we were warning right at the beginning. This was off with our theological partners. 1992, Canada issued kind of a similar thing. It wasn't quite as forceful as what Germany did, but that's important. But I wanted to especially highlight the thunderbolt that Jason mentioned, that July 2007 article in Concordia Journal. Later on, I'm going to give you a sheet that's going to link to, it's not a lot to read, but especially for you delegates, you need to read this faculty statement on the Office of the Ministry. Because I can't stress to you what a thunderbolt this was, to come home from a convention in 2007 and have a statement from the Department of Systematic Theology of both seminaries saying, "Dear Missouri Synod, what you're doing with the Office of Ministry is not okay. XXOO CSL CTS." That doesn't happen. That is not Midwestern nice, which is the defining characteristic, the material principle of the Missouri Synod. You don't do that. This is huge. Huge. I cannot overstate the importance of that. It's never happened in the 167 years of the Synod's history. It's not the done thing. We've got eccentric professors who say all kinds of crazy things in class and in print. but for this super official, in black and white, not signed by one member of the faculty, but signed by both seminaries, whole systematics departments. That's huge. And now, if you go and look in your convention workbook, on pages 437 to 438, you'll find that again, both seminaries' entire faculties have signed on to the task force's recommendations. That's a big deal. That both of them would come out publicly and say, yeah, this is the direction that we need to go. This is a good idea. Okay. Obviously, President Harrison's in favor of this. The question and answer for the candidates for president just came out yesterday. And I mention it because it's very informative, again, because I'm going to get to in a minute, responding to the theology on the other side. So, President Harrison, they've all got like 150 words, so it's almost like, it's like Twitter. They've got to get all this stuff in. It must have been very difficult to write. President Harrison's got a good spiel like he just gave you about why we should support the task force. President David Meyer from Michigan is very forthright in saying, hey, I like the lay licensed deacon program. I think it's good. There's no reason to change it. That's, again, there is what I believe is a minority view in the Senate that what we're doing is A-okay and we should keep doing it. Frankly, I was a little disappointed. I was puzzled. Not disappointed. I was puzzled by President Meyer's statement, because I'm mentioning this because I wrote this paper, a month ago, and I have in here, I'm trying to sell the fact that I think this is a consensus. So I've written down here, the guy with the second most nominations for president leads the faculty that, supported this, statement back in 2007. I can only assume that he's, of course, in agreement with the faculty that he leads. It's not exactly what he said. So take that for what it's worth. Check it out for yourself. I mention it because it shows you that the spectrum in the Senate. Now, I believe that the consensus is right where the task force is. I'll put a little flesh on the bones that Broughton said about that in that 2007 convention. We just passed the S&P thing, and I think it was Ben Ball who put up the substitute resolution, and then I spoke to it for 2 minutes. That's all you get on a substitute resolution, right? 2 minutes. And we lost that to let's just roll on the spot, let's just roll the lay deacon stuff into S&P and be done, right? On the spot, only 2 minutes. It lost, and Broughton told you that, but it only lost 45 to 55, So 5% of the people there changed their minds. So that tells me that even without any preparation, the consensus was building. This thunderbolt comes from the seminaries in 2007. And then in the last 6 years of President Harrison's administration, he and other Senate leaders have been faithfully, patiently, responsibly laying the foundation for a godly resolution to this issue. So during the first administration, they laid the foundation for asking for the task force. Then the task force does their work, thousands of man-hours. And I also second that call. Again, I'll give you a sheet here soon with the links to where you can read the full report of the task force, watch this video that President Harrison mentioned. That really does take 6 years to get all that. Believe it or not, that is full speed ahead to turn the USS Missouri, okay? The issue began at a convention. It's got to be resolved at a convention. And the broad consensus that I believe is really shown in the fact that the seminaries have been so forceful in supporting it, that this broad consensus in the Senate, the only thing that was needed to bring that together the only thing that was lacking was leadership that was willing to lay out a practical roadmap for transitioning away from the licensed lay deacon program that would be considerate to the needs of the districts that are being so served and the congregations that are being so served, and faithful and practical and clear. All that has come together. But there is a minority in the Senate who disagrees strongly. What do they say? What's my response, at least? Well, their disagreement is both theological and practical. They disagree with the theology laid out by those systematic faculties of the seminaries in their 2007 statement. They disagree that there's a practical way to serve the needs of the synod while continuing to believe, teach, and confess that our churches teach that no one should publicly preach or minister the sacraments unless he be regularly called with a regular public call, to put the Latin and the German together. Okay, so I'm going to respond indeed to someone who's very involved in the licensed lay deacon program, a man who loves the church, wants to serve the church. And again, I hope you also picked up, both from Pastor Broughton and from Pastor Harrison, that nobody's mad at anybody. That this is not an us-them issue. This is not a, at the end of the day, we're going to put these licensed lay deacons in the stocks and throw rotten vegetables at them so they'll know how bad they've been. No. That's not it at all. These guys have been put in a bad spot, that they rose to the church's call. I believe, we made a misstep in 1989. It's not their fault. Nobody's mad at them. It's time to, as President Harrison said, honor their godly desire to serve the church, but to make this right. Well, at any rate, so I'm not mad at Mr. Dustin Kunkel of the Northwest District office. He wrote an article a couple months ago on Lutheran Mission Matters. That's a publication of the Lutheran Society for Missiology, which oddly enough shares an address with the faculty of Concordia Seminary, St. Louis. So that must be interesting. So the Mission Society doesn't like the task force, the faculty does. I don't know if they eat lunch together. But at any rate, Mr. Kunkel titles his essay, Category Error, Common Sense in the Office of the Public Ministry in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. He contends that the task force recommendations which seek to bring a godly close to the licensed lay deacon program and reinstates a practice that aligns with the letter of AC 14 amounts to category error, which he defines as a confusion of the person of the pastor and the office of the public ministry. Kunkel argues that the office of the public ministry is more diffused than what he calls an educated, ordained elite. He argues that the congregation can arrange for ministry in a number of different ways and does not need to call men to and place men in the office of the ministry. My chief criticism with Mr. Kunkel's essay is that he's fallen into the pit that he's himself dug. He wants to accuse the task force of category error and setting up straw men, yet he's the one, I believe he's just simply misjudging the ground on which he's arguing. He's misjudging the true points of controversy. So for example, over and over again, Kunkel frames the controversy in such a way, and you got a hint of this in what President Harrison said, that it was an argument about how much theological education and expertise a person needs before he can do word and sacrament ministry. And so Kunkel contends that this is wrong theologically, that we need all this education, because the Bible does not insist on a graduate degree for preachers. He contends that it's inconvenient practically because it costs a lot to attain, and he contends that it's too burdensome, especially on small congregations, new congregations, out-of-the-way congregations, because a man trained with a graduate degree can't find pay commensurate with his education in those places. However, in the argument over licensed lay deacons, the issue of postgraduate theological education is only of secondary importance. The primary argument is about whether or not a man must be called to and placed in the ministry before he starts conducting word and sacrament ministry. Mr. Kunkel sets this most important issue off to one side. Indeed, I find this amazing, but I also find it typical. I mean, Mr. Kunkel is a very eloquent defender of the opposite position. Yet in this whole article, which is obviously timed to coincide with the task force, he addresses the task force directly. He's aware of the task force. He's arguing against it in so many words. In his whole essay, he doesn't mention the Augsburg Confession's 14th article. He doesn't quote from the Treatise on the Power and Primacy of the Pope, another key text in our confessions for this. He doesn't quote Walther's Church and Ministry. He's got to know that these theological confessions, which we as a synod are sworn to uphold in word and deed, are at the heart of the controversy. In a footnote, he wants to beg off. He says, the author assumes knowledge by the reader of the Lutheran concept of the office of the ministry. Well, that's assuming too much. I mean, that's what we're arguing about. Obviously, with this controversy in the church since 1989, there's some disagreement about what the office of the ministry means and is. So you got to argue for that. And in my humble experience, dealing with folks on the other side of this debate, there seems to be a reluctance to argue with that theological meat. There's kind of, well, we'll go on, you'll see what I mean. I believe if Mr. Kunkel gave his attention to Dr. Walther's work, or to the systematic theology faculty's extensive quotations and arguments from the confessions, then he would know that the issue is not postgraduate degrees. It's the biblical, congregational call to the one office of the public ministry. That's what our confessions lay out, and yet licensed lay deacons are very specifically and by design not called to the office of the public ministry. And again, to give you, I honestly believe there's a disconnect between the defenders of the licensed lay deacon program, the theological defenders of it, and the men who actually serve there. Again, watch that video. As President Harrison just mentioned, these guys want to serve the church. The people end up calling them pastor. They're acting like pastors. But Mr. Kunkel says, and I quote from page 90, these are men who, quote, do not want to be pastors. They're not called to pastors. And so there's, again, that kind of statement, I think he actually misunderstands what he's defending. These guys want to serve the church. They want to make sure people get word and sacrament ministry. But he's got a vested interest in them not getting on the clergy roster. Well, all right, we're skipping some stuff here. All right, here's a quote where he comes close to getting to the heart of the matter. LCMS polity is grassroots up. Each community of gathered believers identifies ministry needs and calls, he puts calls in quotation marks, workers to preach the word and administer the sacraments. And then he puts a footnote. The abundance of sources on this aspect of Lutheran theology suggests no need to provide reference here. Again, I beg to differ. I beg to differ because what that statement covers up is the disagreement among Lutherans of various stripes is just this point. And it's what Walther so steadfastly had to fight for in the 19th century, which is there an office of the ministry that's distinct from the priesthood of all believers, to which men must be called and placed into, and then that's a unit, that's an office, an officium, that you're placed into so that you can do tasks. It's a calling. The last part of the catechism, the table of duties, Luther says how people in various standings, various positions, various holy callings should conduct themselves. Well, what are the holy callings he does? Father, mother, children, worker, servant, preacher. So the calling for preacher is like the calling for father or mother. Again, Pastor Broughton did this very well. I talked about there may be a time when you need to step in and do the fatherly thing for somebody in a crazy situation. But father itself is an office with a whole bunch of duties. It's a disruption. It's against the whole idea of a unified vocation to say, well, one guy is going to be the guy who plants the seed of the child, and then we'll have another guy raise him up to kindergarten, and then we'll have another guy then be his dad from kindergarten. You see what I'm saying? It's all of a piece. You can't split off the functions. The other team is saying that the office of the ministry is a basket of jobs. So I got baptism job, I got the preaching job, I got the teaching the confirmation job, I got the visiting the grandma Schickelgruber job, I got all these jobs. And then we as the church can pull out one of those jobs and say, Bart, you baptize people. and you preach on Sunday and you preach on Saturday night, and that's all you're going to do, so I'm just giving you a job from the basket. Okay? That's the theological argument, which is why, especially if you're a delegate, I'm going to encourage you to read the faculty statement, because they'll give you the more details about why the office view of the office of the ministry is to be preferred to that functional, or what I like to call the basket view of the office of the ministry. Okay, so the central point is not graduate level education. And again, as both of our previous speakers have hit on, it's not an argument about ordination. I actually go a little farther than both of those speakers. I'm actually kind of done with the term ordination, because in my experience, what it mainly serves is logomachy. Our confessions and the giants of Lutheran theology, Chemnitz, Gerhard, Walther, they all make it abundantly clear, you heard it in Latin and German, that ordination is nothing more than the solemn public ratification of the public call to the one office of the ministry. So, you can call it ordination, or you can call it flibbertigibbet. Okay? The nonsense, because this is another thing you're going to hear I guarantee you're going to hear at the microphone of the convention. Somebody's going to walk up to the convention mic, and they're going to say, I'm going to now read you this from Walther. Ordination is an adiaphoron. So why are we having this big argument? Why do we have to have this big argument about these licensed lay deacons? They don't need ordination. They've got everything but ordination. Here's the fallacy in that. Ordination is the period on the call. Ordination is nothing other than the solemn public ratification and approval of the call. So if you don't have ordination, and this is the faculty statement goes so far as to say, ordination is not, you can't set it aside. It's not voluntary. It's not arbitrary, because it is the solemn public ratification of the call. So in other words, if ordination is missing, that's my big clue that call is missing. And sure enough, licensed lay deacons are very specifically not called to the office of the ministry. Okay. Of secondary importance, though, is the idea of education. And again, I'm not going to belabor that point because it's been covered. The overseer, the preacher, should be apt to teach. Well, what does that mean? In a society where 30% of all adults have a bachelor's degree and 41% of Americans of European ancestry, which pretty much defines the Missouri Synod as it stands today, 41% of our members have a bachelor's degree. What does that mean about how much education a preacher should have? Well, actually, that is up for debate. We're going to decide to do something different. But you got to start asking yourself, those kind of questions. Should an administrator of baptism know about all the controversies that the church has had about baptism? The guy who's preaching the Word of God, should he be able to read the Word of God in the languages God gave him in? Or can you get by with Bible Works and a 3-week crash course on how to use the Hebrew and Greek tools on Bible Works? You can decide either way. Really, it's not in the Bible. Right. You get to decide what apt to teach means. Paul left those details to Timothy. He just said to Timothy, make sure they're apt to teach. God says to us, make sure they're apt to teach. Now, I've got my own ideas for, in a well-educated society, well-educated, rich Western society, what that should be. Obviously, President Harrison feels strongly about that as well. But again, secondary importance. Secondary importance. The main thing is, are they called to and placed in the office of the ministry? What about Mr. Kunkel's other stuff about the small churches, the new churches, the out-of-the-way churches, the burden of going to seminary, the high cost? This is very interesting. The current director of placement at CSL, Wayne Nallhoff, he's my predecessor in the stewardship stuff with Synod, and he's very good with numbers, very good with helping his graduates understand their finances. And what he has found is that, on average, students at the seminary are adding maybe $3,000 a year that they're at the seminary to their debt. So these guys you hear about entering the ministry with $80,000, $90,000 in debt, it's all coming from their undergrad. Or 7/8 of it is coming from their undergrad. So, that's a problem. For sure that's a problem. But it's a lesson that's very easily learned by parents after about one kid. And you'll soon find that, and this is happening in America, there's quite a crisis in secondary ed or post-secondary ed because cheaper schools are getting a lot more popular. So that problem is self-correcting. And again, I find some unreasonableness. For example, Mr. Kunkel he won't even accept, he doesn't even like the task force recommendation that these men over 55, basically they just get to come into the ministry with an interview at the regional level. They don't got to pay anything. They don't got to move to Fort Wayne or St. Louis. But he's still not even. So it's not exactly a practical argument, is it? Why would you be against that? Well, it's a theological argument. He really believes that the church doesn't have to put men in the office. They can just pick out things from the basket and say, do these. So that's why I truly believe there's some reluctance, even though the task force is reluctance on a minority in the Synod, even though the task force is mild, to say the least. So, lastly, Mr. Kunkel really is himself committing category error, because he says that the congregations, in view of being the church in that place, he says they have the authority to disregard the office of the public ministry. Well, I should say they have the authority in regard to it. That's right. But every authority we have is from the Lord. We don't have authority to do whatever we want, but only to do as the Lord has given us to do. So as Walther noted long ago, and as it says in our confessions before him, as it's been restated by the systematics faculty, the church, the congregation, exercises its authority over the office of the ministry by calling men to that office. It's nonsense to say the congregation has authority to call men to the public ministry, therefore they don't have to call men to the public ministry. But that's the argument. If you're going to sum it up, that's the argument. So again, if Mr. Kunkel is here, I would say, I'd really like to hear your response to the systematic theology faculty essay. And until I hear that kind of interaction, I think I'm going to go with those guys. In short, congregations need to do their job in regard to the office of the public ministry. They need to call them into that office, and they need to settle for nothing less. And yes, they need to ensure that the whole biblical mandate regarding the ministry is upheld, including this. Again, this is another hat I wear with the Synod as coordinator of stewardship. When I help congregations who are struggling financially, one of the first verses we go over is 1 Corinthians 9:14. In the same way, the Lord, that's Jesus, the guy nailed to the cross, God in the flesh, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. That's in the Bible. That's a mandate for a full-time ministry. Mr. Kunkel says, but gosh, that's hard for people in out-of-the-way places, small places. And then Mr. Kunkel goes on to argue that the church of today is really a lot more like the first century than the 16th or the 20th centuries. 16th or to the 20th century, Christianity's got this cultural power and everything, and we got all this money and we can do stuff. But now today, we really need to be more flexible with the ministry. We need to use this basket approach because it's cheaper. And I kind of scratched my head and I thought, but to what century was 1 Corinthians written? I reckon those folks lived in the first century when the church was small and scattered and rural or dankly urban in a city like Corinth or spread out, but really small and poor. To that kind of church, St. Paul wrote, those who preach the gospel should make their living by the gospel. And we've always done that. We've always done that. Now that means that sometimes there's one preacher for many churches and there's lay readers on most Sundays. But that the guy who's doing Word and Sacrament ministry, hey, look, it's in the Bible. You got to chew on it. All right. All right, finally. Although Mr. Kunkel, I've kind of hit on this. You know what? I've hit on it enough. Very good. This paper will be up at Gottesdienst if you want to read the rest. Now we're going to look at the actual task force. What you all came to hear. Recommendation 1 from the task force. The task force recommends that those licensed lay deacons who are regularly preaching and administering the sacraments be required to apply for a colloquy to examine their ability to teach and overall fitness for ministry. We have a meeting. Do you line up with 1 Timothy 3? Upon certification by the colloquy committee, they'll be called by the congregations where they've been serving and ordained into the office of the public ministry and placed on the roster of specific ministry pastors. Well, now I've got to respond to maybe some folks are going to argue against the task force from a different angle, from a different side. And this is something I've also heard on the interwebs, on the Facebooks. That, that's not okay. That's like, these guys who've been, doing this un-AC 14 thing, and now we're just going to give them an interview and they get enroll in the seminary as specific ministry pastors and not have to go through the whole boat at seminary like I had to go through the whole boat at seminary. And we're just going to say, no harm, no foul. Don't like that. Makes me angry. They ought to what? And I guess that's my response to it. They ought to what? Sit in the timeout chair? You want to give them the Henry II treatment, and they've got to stand barefoot outside Westminster Cathedral for 3 days and fast and flagellate themselves? Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. If you, for example, if you're a critic of how the SMP program has been implemented, and there's room for criticism there in my book, I think we could do that better than we're currently doing it. But the specific ministry pastor program, as you might guess from the title, creates pastors. That's a big improvement. So in other words, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. If we roll everybody into the specific ministry pastor program, we can improve that program along the way. We can tweak it, we can adjust it, but it gets everybody into a route toward call and placement in the office, call and ordination, examination, call, ordination, or examination, call, ratification of the call. Again, we're not going to play the logomachy game. Don't let anybody try to make this an argument about the word ordination. Then they go on to talk about different ways, different individual things that this will require. They talk about it for a lot of pages. It just goes on and on and on. Very thorough. We're still not there yet. If you're a delegate, you have to read this. Recommendation 2. The task force recommends that the Synods SMP program be fully utilized since it has been developed as an approach to theological education, especially for those settings where finances and/or geography are obstacles to preparation. The Synod must ensure that financial constraints do not prevent any eligible candidate for participating in SMP. We're going to put our money where our mouth is. Is your confession important to you? Well, then this needs to be funded. If you pass this task force, and this is again perhaps for those of us who have a high view of the ministry, have a high view of our confessions, what does this mean? So we pass this task force, everything's hunky-dory. It's got to be funded. We have to be faithful in supporting our districts and holding our districts accountable and supporting the Synod. The task force recommends that the Synod's EIIT, that's the ethnic, what's the I and the I? Ethnic Institute
Immigrant.
Ethnic Immigrant Institute of Theology, there you go. CHS,
Hispanic.
Center for Hispanic Studies, and Cross-Cultural Institute be fully utilized to supply training for pastors in cross-cultural settings, et cetera, et cetera. What are these things? Well, these are other routes to ordination. So basically, we have, I went to seminary with a guy from the Sudan, John Loam, however you say his name. And John is what I called him. And I'm not going to learn whatever it is they speak in Sudan, is that Swahili or Arabic or whatever. You know, it's not going to work for me, okay? Je parle français, ça va, meine Bitte Deutsch, but I ain't going to learn whatever. So in that setting, that's a more important, I mean, that's huge. Who's going to do that? You know, who's going to invest all, well, these guys already know it. Why would you teach me that when John, that's his native language? So we've got a route for ministry for those kind of odd situations. Likewise, burgeoning Latin population in the United States, same thing. Okay? So again, are you a critic of how those programs are sometimes used? Hey, we can make things better. Be a constructive critic. Great. But they lead to AC 14 compliant calls and ordinations. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Recommendation 4. The task force recommends that the districts of the synod vigorously encourage and facilitate the establishment of multi-point parishes where that is geographically and financially feasible and when individual congregations can no longer provide for a pastor. This is the way it used to be done, right? In the congregation where we're sitting right now, in the congregation, in the other 2 congregations I serve, and a congregation in South Staunton that's no longer there, and a congregation at DeCamp Junction that's no longer there. At one point, one guy served all 5 places. And he only had a horse and buggy. All right? It can be done. Right now, in another paper I wrote about this, in Calhoun County, just north of here, in Forgotonia, Illinois, the land between the rivers, the Illinois and the Mississippi, there's, I think, 4 or 5 Roman Catholic parishes, 1 priest. They manage, we can manage. In some cases, despite the best efforts of congregations, a pastor will be unavailable. In various ways, congregations of the Synod currently make use of technology to aid ministry. In such instances, technological resources, for example, Fritz, live streaming a sermon, may be helpful aid, coupled with lay-led readings and prayers, as was just mentioned. Other temporary aids may be rescheduling service times to allow an area pastor to serve. It's sad that that had to be stated, right? Laymen reading sermons prepared for the congregation by a pastor or lady. Okay, so what they're getting across is, this is gonna, when you go to a multi-point parish, if you're in Montana and the distances are not, like our parish is 5 miles on a side, but the distances might be 50 miles on a side, you're gonna have to be flexible. You might have the pastor 1 week a month. And you're going to have to make arrangements for a lay-led service on the other weeks a month. Well, a lot of Missouri Synod congregations only want communion once a month. So
It works.
that's where that tradition came from. Originally, if you have a parish like that, I bet you live somewhere in rural America where they used to have to share a pastor. Recommendation 6. The task force recommends that the Synod and districts recruit and encourage eligible inactive status pastors, retirees, as well as others eligible for calls. Hint, hint. Let the reader understand. Let the reader understand. To be available for service in congregations and missions of the Synod on a full or part-time basis, bivocationally, particularly in those congregations facing financial, geographic, and demographic decline. How many congregations do we have in the Synod?
About 6,000.
6,000.
How many preachers we got? 9,500.
So how can we have 400 vacancies?
Well, vacancies are good. You need a certain level of vacancy. You can argue what it might be, what the optimum number is. It's probably between 7 and 10% is probably the optimum number of vacancies for calls, because it's like that little that little magic square game you used to have in the car before they had Sudoku. You got to slide the numbers around. There's always one blank spot, right? Otherwise, you can't slide the numbers around. So I don't know what the proper number is. I got my druthers, but it doesn't matter. There's got to be some vacancies. But yes, but that's exactly the point. In these hard to reach places, we do have a group of men who are eligible for those calls. Now there are difficulties there, right? Where do retired Lutheran pastors go? Florida, Arizona. Where do small Lutheran congregations having a hard time filling their pulpits exist? Minnesota, Nebraska. So yeah, there's some challenges there. That's why that paragraph started off with vigorously encourage and recruit. Okay.
CRM.
And the CRM status was guys who are eligible for a call but are not currently in a call. That was what was mentioned. These other lists, same thing. Those guys may be a different resource to mine. Exactly. Recommendation 7: district lay training programs are to be commended with thanksgiving for the many willing lay servants who seek further theological education and desire to serve in various capacities in their congregations. The task force recommends that a major emphasis in lay training programs be placed on the role of evangelists and the task of outreach in the increasingly diverse and challenging world of Los Estados Unidos. Maybe you don't like this. Maybe you see lay training programs as areas fraught with potential for mischief. Maybe you have a sour taste in your mouth from an experience you've had with somebody who was trained in one of the current lay programs that we got going, maybe X, Y, Z. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, because I have a fact of life for you. In any healthy church body, there is going to be a certain level of healthy energy amongst the laity. There's going to be a number of people who are going to want to do more and not settle for doing less. This is the origin of monasticism. Now, monasticism is not a good idea. We're all Lutheran here, right? But monasticism exists for a reason, because there are a lot of people who don't want to be priests, but they would love to be a lay brother. They want to be more involved in the church. They want to do stuff. You have to have an outlet for that energy. You have to direct it in a godly direction. So again, don't let if you've got a bad taste in your mouth from one of these programs, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We can make it better. We have the technology. We can rebuild the lay ministry program. Recommendation 8. In conjunction with recommendation 7, the task force recommends that congregations and districts be encouraged to identify individuals for special training in attention to evangelism. Can we start handing those out? Just have them passed around. Oh, I need one. Gosh. Thanks. As individuals are identified, we encourage congregations and districts to facilitate their training, both through existing synodical efforts and programs and special intensive training through district lay programs. So again, they're saying we want districts to do this work, we want the city to be engaged in this work. The lay folks have a lot to offer the church, and that in many ways they're an untapped resource. That if we can get good training for lay folks who want to have that kind of extra work in the church, that we should utilize them. All right, you're getting now just a little one-sheet piece of resources for study and action. So for study, I've given you 2 links. The first one is to this joint Departments of Systematic Theology statement on the office of the ministry. If you're a delegate, pastor, or lay, you need to read this. The Missouri Synod, there's a reason that half the delegates are lay people, half the delegates are preachers. Don't think if you're a lay delegate that this theology is beyond you. No. Jesus tells the whole church to be on guard against, to test the spirits, to be on guard against wolves in sheep clothing. It's your job as well. So you need to read that. And then, of course, the LCMS Task Force recommendation the video summary, the full report, the executive summary. Familiarize yourself to it. I hope I have inoculated you against the kind of arguments you'll probably hear from the convention floor. Arguments that ignore the confessions and say, well, we can't practically keep the confessions. Well, sure we can. And you don't want to be a church that tosses its confession aside in the face of difficulty anyway. And then I encourage you to respond. I encourage you to comment on the task force's recommendations. Positive comments, especially from pastoral and lay delegates to the convention, will be very helpful for the floor committee to see. Because there's one more step. The task force recommendations have to now go to floor committee 13 to become a resolution. And so, especially for delegates to the Synod Convention, floor committee 13 routes to ministry will be, okay, so I said that. They'll have an open hearing before the first gavel of the convention. This will all be announced. So if you can go up to Milwaukee a day early, is it usually 1 day early or 2 days? Usually it's 1 day early, right?
Saturday morning.
Saturday morning. Hustle up there, get there Friday, so you're there Saturday morning. It is so important that delegates who support the task force recommendations, and after listening to us today, how could you not, go to the floor committee hearing and voice your support. And let me say, especially if you're a lay person. It's equally important that delegates, pastor and lay, go to the microphone to speak in favor of the recommendations from the convention floor in a succinct and well-informed manner. These things don't happen by accident. I'm glad that President Harrison is confident this is going to pass. I think he's right, but as Pastor Peterson would say, ora et labora, pray and work. It will take work to get this through. There will be a minority, but it will be a very vocal minority who will be fighting this tooth and nail. But it's a good recommendation. Is it perfect? What is? It's a good recommendation that will get us back on the path to supporting AC 14